of illustration pictures that I hope will help us understand these concepts a little better. So the first one I want to modify what I'm going to hold you accountable on the test. We talked about the middle trap, and I was like, yeah, it's not, but that's not fair. So on the test, I'm just going to give you, or I'm just going to ask about the upper and lower's contribution to the upper rotation. Okay. So in other words, and it illustrates it on your circle, no different than when we did anterior fibers of the gluteus medius and minimus. So in other words, the muscle was on the line because all the fibers are abduction pullers, and then the anterior fibers were the internal rotation pullers. So it's similar that most of them is true, but if the middle fibers are running through the axis of rotation, I said that last class, but then I was like, well, that's not fair, but we'll just round up. So on the test, I will emphasize the upper and the lower working as the force couple as upward rotators, okay? Cool. What I mean by that is I will not have an answer choice that says all of the fibers of the trapezius. If I do the upward rotation stuff, the answer choices will be upward and downward fiber, or upward fibers and downward fiber. Upper trap, lower trap. And I found this really good illustration of that concept where there's the axis of rotation. You can see how the upper and lower would work as a force couple, but the ones in the middle are pulling right on the axis. So I just wanted to clarify. Now, this illustration is really cool with trap working with the serratus, but I found an even better picture that I think gives us everything. So look at this picture. So what we've done so far is the image on the left that I was trying to illustrate, that force couple with the traps, and then the serratus anterior pulling the feet from the bottom. So that was a really good illustration of that. And today we're going to work on the rest of our scapular muscles. That'll be trying to spin it the other way. So I just found a nice little illustration that's going to show you kind of how these muscles are working to spin the scapula upwardly and downward. Those are posted on the old Moodle. So let's summarize. We've talked about the trapezius. All the fibers are going to be retractors. The upper fibers are going to be elevators, lower fibers depressors, and then upper and lower force coupling to pull in the direction of upper rotation of the scapula. We talked about the serratus anterior, which is a protraction puller and upward rotation puller of the scapula. Today, we're going to finish off with our pectoralis minor. And another reminder to you guys, you can abbreviate these however you want. Like there's no official way to abbreviate. I'm just trying to save space on the circle. But if you might get this confused with pec major, you see what I'm saying? So you might have a different way of wanting to abbreviate. Like you may want to do big P with the MIN. Totally up to you guys. How you abbreviate them is totally up. It's just a teaching tool. And we'll do levatus, scapula, and rhomboids. And then that'll be it for muscles with motion practice. So a holistic view, the trapezius are the most superficial, like gastroc over soleus, biceps over brachialis. So if we take the trap out, then we could see some more of our other scapular muscles that are deep inside, our rhomboids and our levatus scapula. Rhomboids is plural. You have rhomboids major and minor, but they're sister muscles. So when we say rhomboids, we're combining the major and minor plural. Let's look at them, and some motion pulls are going to be super obvious, I think. So if you had to put a cup of coffee on one function. I know where I'd put my, a cup of coffee used to be like less than $1. So if you had $10 for a cup of coffee with retraction pull, I think is kind of obvious to see. Is that cool? Like trying to pull the scapula to the spine. So retraction pull. A secondary function is look at if all the rhomboids did was pull. I'm going to show you different pictures. This is just art. This is just an illustration. I'm going to show you different photos. If all the rhomboids did was retraction pull, then those fibers would just be like horizontal. Does that make sense? So the fact that they run at an angle tells me not only are they trying to retract, but they're also trying to bring the scapula up and across. Does that make sense? So there's an elevation pull to the rhomboids as well. The hardest, as an example. So remember we talked about the axis of rotation being up on the spine of the scapula up here. So let's pretend that this is the vertebral border of the scapula. The way those rhomboid fibers run, if this is upward rotation, those fibers would want to be pulling in a direction of downward rotation. Does that make sense? So the rhomboids are retractors, elevators, and rotators. Now, we look through. Let's say like trying to think of, well, we could use obliques, I think, for the example I'm trying to give, where you have like left transverse and right transverse, and they can cancel out transversely and work together sagittally. So you have downward rotators that run like this, and upward rotators that crisscross and run like this. Because if you think about it, the downward fibers of the trap have the opposite up and down as the rhomboids. Like they crisscross, just like obliques crisscross on the same side. Does that make sense? So naturally, the lower fibers and the rhomboids would cancel out rotationally, but work together retractionally. Like that's just another example of how things can cancel out and neutralize and work together in certain directions of motion pull. Fibers run opposite. So in other words, if we mirrored the trapezius here, those lower fibers would run like this. Does that make sense? So in other words, the rhomboids on this left side are running like this. So they would, if you needed retractors, both of those sets of muscles can work because they would just cancel out rotationally and work together retracting. So again, just to clarify, for this test, rhomboids, major and minor, have their sister muscles. It's like when in grad school you'll learn semantics, but like when we were learning about the wrist muscles, technically there's an extensor corpi radialis lumvis brevis, but we're just going to call it extensor corpi radialis because they have the same function. Sometimes we'll just do that because I'm trying not to overload you too many. And then in grad school, we can learn the nuances of some of these little nitpicky things. They're not nitpicky. But the point is that they have the same functions. So we're going to include them and say rhomboids, plural, major, and minor. You know what? No, don't be impressive for that. That's what the biceps femoris is. We don't say biceps femoris, long head and short head. You know, so when we say rhomboids, plural, it's just, that's the major and minor. But on the test, I'm just going to ask you for Romans. All right. Let's look at that levator scapula. So the levator scapulae, scapula, latte, I'm sure I'm missing a spot. He's wrong. It's all very sad. This one should have a little bit of inference to its name. Elevator, elevation, levata, pulling in a direction of elevation. It's like an elevator. Its retraction pull, although present, I think it should be obvious that it's definitely much more steeper than our rhomboids in our lower trap, right? So whatever contribution it has to retraction, although present, it'll have a much greater contribution to elevation because it's most of the pull. Right? So let me let's look at our circles. And so this would be rhomboids. Retraction pull because it's on the left side of the vertical. Elevation pull because it's superior to the horizontal. And then the downward rotation pull arrows being inserted. So in other words, traction. This is so hard because that visual is so bad. Traction, elevation, downward rotation. So it's not listed literally because if I drew it anywhere else, it wouldn't be able to show you functionally the pulls. So I'm not saying literally it's pulling on the top part down, but in terms of the motion it's trying to cause, this illustrates functional motions. Retraction pull, elevation pull, downward rotation. Read a scapula. It's going to have a much more elevation pull, but again, technically, it's bringing the scapula to the spine, and to get to your spine, you gotta retract. So elevation, retraction, and I'm going to try to explain the downward rotation pull. This is not hard. You can see the serratus anterior, you can see all right. The easiest, in my opinion, the easiest way to see the levator scapula pull of downward rotation is if we first upwardly rotate the scapula. So here would be your scapula representation, and that levator scapula is pulling here. The axis of rotation is way over here. But if I upwardly rotate first, I think it's much easier to see the downward rotation pull. Does that make sense? But just know that even there, because that axis is out over here, it still has a downward rotation pull to it. But I think it's just easier to see if we upwardly rotate the scapula first, and then you say, oh, that muscle's pulling on this corner. It's going to be a downward rotation pull. Does that make sense? All right, guys. Who's grabbing this last muscle? Oh, pectoralis minor. There it is, right here. I'm going to show you a more detailed picture of it. I think this is a great example of trying to see a three-dimensional concept in a two-dimensional picture is not easy. So I'm going to utilize the skeleton. So the pectoralis minor starts on your ribs, I think like 3, 4, and 5. And it goes to the coracoid process. Now your ribs are more in front of your coracoid. You can't see that on that picture. Like you don't see depth. Like you don't see the third dimension. So it's really hard to see. One of the functions is really hard to see from this one. One is super easy to see. Hey, it's pulling down. So the depression pull, I think, is not hard to see on this picture. Pulling in the direction of scapular depression. What's hard to see here is, well, if it starts on the anterior part of the ribs and it's going anterior to posterior, it's trying to pull the coracoid, it's trying to orbit the scapula over the ribs. So it's pulling in a direction of protraction. That's really hard to see with this two-dimensional picture. So I think a better you see the protraction pull, if you learn by seeing, is this original picture. Look how it would be pulling anteriorly. Make sense? This view, I think, gives us a good angle of protraction pull, depression pull, but it doesn't see our third dimension, which I'm going to talk to you about now, the downward rotation. So before I get into that final downward rotation pull explanation, I think it's important to remind ourselves, like, what do we mean when we say terms like pecs? Does it mean the right and the left pectoralis major? Does it mean the pectoralis major and pectoralis minor? Pectoralis major crosses your shoulder and is going to do shoulder stuff. Pectoralis minor doesn't cross your shoulder. So in other words, if we say pecs, major and minor, the major is going to influence shoulder stuff and the minor is just going to influence scapular stuff. So in other words, if you were doing push-ups and you had protraction with it, I'm not saying the minor doesn't work at all. You're doing shoulder stuff and you need certain scapular muscles, cool. But we need to know that I'm not working my minor if I'm just doing glenohumeral stuff. That gets confusing sometimes, majors and minors. All right, save the best for last. That's the best view for us. All right, guys, that coracoid is as lateral as you can get on the scapula. Because remember, the scapula doesn't fit flush. It's kind of at an angle. Some people refer to this as the scapular plane, which is really just kind of in between sagittal and frontal. It's like calling northeast its own direction. But this is sitting at an angle. So we can't look at it like this. We kind of have to look at it this. See what I did there? We can't look at it like this. We have to look at it like this. We have to look at it like this. So this coracoid process, although it might look like it's kind of in the middle of the scapula, no. It's actually very lateral to the scapula. It's very much on the outside. So if we had serratus anterior and traps pulling in a direction of upward, the pectoralis minor is pulling in a direction of downward rotation. I'm going to try to explain that in a few different ways. Okay. Here is our book. And our spine of our scapula is back there. And the coracoid process would be like floating right here. This would be upward rotation. True? So what I'm trying to get you to see is that pectoralis minor is pulling like this in a direction of downward. And bringing it full circle to here. Upper trap, lower trap, serratus anterior, upward rotators, rhomboids, levator scapula, pec minor, downward rotators. Y'all remember for 310 that scapular motion, like I can elevate and depress, protract, retract, but I'm not upwardly or downwardly rotating unless I have shoulder stuff, right? So our upward and downward rotation examples are always going to involve shoulder motion. Because remember, the scapula is upwardly rotating in order to reposition the 310 callback. There's our socket, and there's our ball. And if all we did was move glenohumeral joint, we would only get about 120 degrees over our head. So the upward rotation, I can't do it because it's screwed in, but the upward rotation of the scapula helps to reposition the shoulder joint so that we could get it above our head. In other words, here's the ball, here's the socket. This happens so that we can get over our head. And another cool thing about that too is when the scapula upwardly rotates, it allows the humerus to sit on it more than when it was here. So by upwardly rotating, it gives us like at least a little bit of a
stability.
Absolutely, 100%. But there's a term when you're on an incline. I was trying to think of the word incline. Like it gives it an incline. Like here, you're like falling off a cliff. But here, at least you're on an incline. You're on an inclined plane. Everything you said was correct. I was trying to search for the word incline. We good? Y'all ready for some examples? Do some examples? Do some examples. Exactly what it looks like when I do them. Remember I said the law that says you can't do exercise in the neutral, make it look neutral. But then again, maybe no exercise is true. Maybe that's the lesson. Help me, help me, help me, help me, help me. Where you at? Where you at? .310 question. We know that's not shoulder, right? Scapula. Now you may feel I think I talked about this at the shoulder. You may feel your arm muscles, your bicep, your tricep. You may feel those muscles like turn on, like they may be pumping when you're doing shrugs. But their innervation isn't for movement influence, it's for stability influence. Like literally, especially like the biceps long head, short head, and the triceps long head are literally creating traction to prevent the humerus from falling out of socket. Right? So it makes sense those muscles would be on. And it would also make sense why people might say, well, when I'm holding the dumbbells, I feel these muscles, so I must be working. But those muscles aren't working in that case for movement. They're just working for stability. Okay. So we want to talk about the muscles involved for motion influence. So we'll do our process. External force is trying to do what to the scapula. Therefore, I need muscles that are pulling how at the scapula. And then we match up motion with agonistic pull to see our contractions. And we use our circles, our lists, our break. Guys, I don't care how you do it. You might be able to see those pictures that I posted with pictures that you have, and you might just be able to see them all. That's cool. Until you get to that point, that's why I have these extra tools to help us, to help remind us of these pillars and these directions of motion, the primary. And just asking for feedback, did those little illustrations that I found, was that helpful to see? All right, take a minute. Use your circles, use your lists, use your notes, and say, okay, I know I need this group of muscles that pull in this direction of motion. Who are those muscles? And then say, match up the concentric and the eccentric contraction. Elevators or depressors? Elevators, good. Who are those muscles? Upper trapezius, rhomboids, levator scapula. Cool. Left to right, concentric or eccentric? Concentric, elevation. Elevators do elevation concentrically when they're working. Right to left, elevators do depression eccentrically. All that's saying, what I love about elevators is that literally this is like working an elevator in this example, where the same cable that made you come up is going to let you go down while still pulling up. All right, let's do it a trickier one. Let's start off with isometric, and then I will give you the motion like I do on the test. In addition, let's only have an upward and downward rotation conversation to go along with the shoulder motion that's going to happen. So in this exercise, she's going to fluctuate between ab and ad. So what's the external force trying to do to her shoulders? Thus, what's the external force trying to do to her scapula? Identify the muscle she would need at the scapula for these practice examples, and then who those muscles must be. Isometrically to hold this position. And after we do that, then I'll give you context of motion, practice your contractions. So in other words, I know you guys know this, but I just want to make sure that I am doing a better job of explaining questions. That R is trying to bring her hands up. Just want to make sure. She turned off all her muscles, there'd be some motion happening at her scapula. I'm only asking about the upward and downward rotation component. Yes, there'd be an elevation component, but I'm going to ask elevation and depression stuff when I don't move your shoulders, just for the purposes of this class. When I'm asking you about upward and downward rotation motions, we're going to move the shoulder. Make that interesting. That's why I get all those bruises. Hitting my hip on the corner of the table every day. All right, guys, what is the barbell trying to do to the scapula? Up, downward rotation. Outstanding. So it's the process of elimination. If the bar is trying to upwardly rotate, I don't need upward rotation pullers. In this example, like downward rotation pullers. And you need to use whatever works for you to be able to tell me who those primary muscles are. Who are the downward rotation pullers, rhomboids, levator scapula, pectoral. Right. It's actually similar to this one, but if you remember from through 10, a lot of these exercises are named from global references, not local references. So that's called a lat pull down. So let's do the same example for a pull up. And yes, I'm going to go to dynamics. We're going to get some contractions, but I first want you to see. I just want to make sure we're clear on not making this mistake first, and then to come to the other. But I just want to make sure we're on the same page. If she relaxed her muscles, her center of mass would fall down. But that word down doesn't necessarily translate to scapular motion. That's what I'm trying to get to. So sometimes when we name these exercises, lat pull down, pull up, like it plants a seed where they must be different. They're not different. Just cat and bottle stuff, right? All right, another piece. She's isometrically holding this position. Figure out upper rotators or downward rotators of the scapula. I'm not disrespecting shoulder muscles. I'm just not having a shoulder conversation. That's all. We're having scapular conversation.
Would you clarify those spiritual use?
I have to. Yeah. Well, now I'd have to clarify whether it's in the question or the answers, right? So if I gave you this question and I was asking shoulder stuff, I was just, I wouldn't have a scapular answer and a shoulder answer unless I did like a combination, like this muscle with the shoulders. But absolutely, I have to clarify. And if I don't, oops, I didn't mean to do it. Just call me over and say, hey, dude, what did you forget here? And I'll look at it and be like, Macaulay Culkin's Home Alone. But absolutely. And it goes to 310. We analyze motion joint by joint, we analyze muscles joint by joint. And that's going to help us. It's meant to help us not be overwhelmed. There's some dynamic movements in our fields. So to not be overwhelmed by everything, all you got to do is say, well, wow, that was a multi movement thing. Let me start at the ankle. What did the ankle do? What did the knee do? What did the hip do? What did the trunk do? What did the shoulder do? That it's meant to make something complex at least palatable. All right, gravity is actually trying to upwardly rotate her scapula. Does that make sense? And that messes with us because this exercise is called a pull-up, but it has the same external forces as the lat pull down. In one, literally the bar is coming down, and in the other, we're going down, but in both cases, our hands are trying to go over our heads. Whether it's, let me see if I could do this silly example. You ever see Austin Powers, that old movie? Like he's doing like the different escalator and stuff. All right, let's see if I can do this. This is the exact same thing as this. All right, let me try it again. Like I'm old. I think this tapping the head and rubbing the belly is not as easy. Okay. This motion is the exact same as this motion. So don't let that confuse you. Lat pull down, pull up, it's the same muscle. Because we have the same external force trying to do the same thing to our shoulders. The lat pull down, the external force is going to do this. In the pull up, if you turn off all your muscles, you have the same motions. So don't let the name of the exercise mess with you, okay? All right, let's give some dynamics to it. She lowers herself down from this position. She's still holding on to the bar. She lowers herself down. So on that, I can give you that example. I'm just gonna take this. I'll give you different options with concentric and eccentric. And we've done this a million times, right? So I might put pec minor concentric, pec minor eccentric. Serratus anterior concentric, serratus anterior eccentric. And all you have to do is identify a group, right? Hey, I need downward rotators. Whoa, serratus anterior is not now. I get to scratch out all those. And now I'm between which pec minor, lowering herself down, that will be eccentrics, right? Because the downward rotators are allowing upward rotation. I think this has, and that's kind of why I save it for last. This one is a little weird because like you're spinning the merry-go-round differently than how we're used to spinning the merry-go-round. Like we're used to spinning a synovial joint merry-go-round, hips and shoulders and radial joints. But this is literally a floating triangle on our thorax. And so it makes sense. Like we're going to have muscles that are in different areas, like traditionally, that could be still trying to spin this merry-go-round the same. So if she lowers herself in a muscle, as if she lets the bar go up. Same muscles, same contraction. I just want to make sure we see how those are the same thing. I'm not saying one's not harder than the other. I'm not saying that at all. I mean, obviously, I could choose to do 10 pounds on this. I can't choose to do 10 pounds if I'm doing a pull-up unless I'm in one of those fancy like counter. But it's the same muscle. So in this exercise, I would say, unless if I had a before and after, cool. But it's if she was starting up here, I'd say she pulls the bar down to the chest, or she lets the bar go up, or again, we'll have a before and after. This one gets scapular. The muscles that would be contributing by pulling directly on the scapula. So let's first do isometrics. That's the easiest one. So you identify the agonist based off of why they need to work, external force-wise, and then your circles, your lists, your photographic memory, I don't care. Just who are those major muscles? So basically, I'm asking you, do I need protractors or retractors? I guess protractors or retractors. Okay, if he relaxes all of the muscles at his scapula, wouldn't protraction happen? Right, so he'd need retraction pullers. Does that make sense to hold this position? Again, not disrespecting the shoulder, but we're talking about scapula. He would need muscles that are trying to bring his scapula to his spine. Does that make sense?
Why wouldn't you agree?
Well, we don't have a motion here, but what we do have is the weight of his arm and those blocks are trying to protract him. So he would need retraction pullers to hold this position. He would need retractors to hold that position isometrically because gravity's trying to protract.
I thought that means we're trying to retract them because his arms are up and he's choking.
Let's see how I could put this. If he didn't move his shoulders, let's say we froze his shoulders, so this was just one rigid length, right? If he dropped his arms, his scapula would move away from his spine. Yes or no? So if the scapula goes away from his spine, that's protraction. Retraction would be bringing his scapula to his spine. So this would be retraction. This would be retraction in terms of the motion. This would be protraction in terms of the motion. Gravity would be trying to protract his scapula. So he would need retraction pullers to try to pull.
I see.
Yeah. No, you're fine. You're fine. I could totally see that. No, you're chef's kiss. I totally get that. That makes a lot of sense. And you know what? That very well could be the case. Um, yeah, that never dawned to me. That never dawned on me. I thought he was using them as weights. Yeah, because that was my intent, was to find something that he would be using as weights. So I tell you what, that's a great point. When you try to find something that's not this. Yeah, I thought he was just lifting the blocks up there. Because it looks like from my view, it looks like he's gripping them.
Yeah, let's do that. He's as hard as a sea.
But example that's
Yeah, that's why I have
we don't want to use. I want to use super obvious examples. So let me see if I can put in a dumbbell. Let's see if we can find some. I think I need to have. Easier. And well, this one gives some absolute dynamics instead of being given some verbal instruction dynamics. Cool. So let's go top to bottom and then bottom to right. Bottom, top to bottom. So, remember we were talking about how doing lower extremity, and I said that like if you had your arm, we don't sling anymore. If we don't, we don't want to put anybody in a static position because you can have an atrophy, and you want to keep things moving as much as possible, as much as you can. And so the life experiment is if you sling your arm for weeks, when you come out of the sling, it's going to be very stiff. So we sling our hips a lot in our activities of daily living. Driving a car, sitting in your chair, sitting in your seat, working at a desk job or seated. We do a lot of our hips are flexed a lot. So when we come out of that sling, our hips can typically be tight. And when they're tight, we just anterior pelvic girdle rotate to keep that hip flexed. Okay. Very similar when you're going to be working with older people as they get older, posture and everything, and they're going to get more kyphotic is just kind of more protracted and rounded. And so some of your rehab and exercises might emphasize certain scapular muscles to try to keep that scapula as functionally in place as possible. All right. Retractors, because the gravity is trying to protract us from bottom to top. That was retraction, so it's concentric. Top to bottom, retraction, concentric, bottom to top, protraction, eccentric. And then you just find your way to tell me who are those retractors. And if you do it off of visual circles, great. The retractors are trying to pull the scapula to the spine. Who are those muscles? Levator scapula, rhomboids, trapezius. On the test, I'm just going to pick one. Just pick one. That's why you got to know them all, because I might pick any of them. Cool. On Friday, we'll do other scapular examples. We'll do some protraction stuff. We'll do some upper rotation stuff. And we'll make sure you guys are in position, and we'll do the rest of the stuff when we do the other stuff. Yeah, that's a good day.